Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and once again, happy Thanksgiving week. I hope that your week is going well. Maybe you've already got time off of work. I don't know, but I hope that things are going well, and if you are doing prep work, I hope that is going well. If you haven't done so already, take your turkey out of your freezer. Yeah, it's Tuesday. You need to take your turkey out of your freezer. Get on that. And if it's still frozen, put it in a sink full of cold water. Don't run hot water on it. Sink full of cold water. But yeah, our turkey has been out of the freezer and in the fridge for a couple of days. We are going to spend the day with two friends of ours that we have spent, my husband has spent pretty much every Thanksgiving that he is in California with for the last 20 plus years. And I have spent the majority of the Thanksgivings that I have lived in California since we started dating with them as well. So it is definitely a tradition. It's going to be pretty small, just 6 of us this year. My husband and I, our friends, and then mom and stepdad of the female of that couple. So should be a good time. It will be small. It will be lovely, and I am looking forward to it. And we have, as I said, we have a turkey in the refrigerator thawing out, and it will be deep fried with not alongside. After they do the Thanksgiving turkey, they will deep fry ours so that we will be able to take it home and have leftovers, and I will be able to make soup out of the leftovers and all of that fun stuff. Because that's, that there's trade-offs to going to someone else's house for Thanksgiving dinner. You don't have as much craziness that happens in your own house in terms of prep and cleanup, although hopefully you're helping with that at the host's home. But then you also don't have leftovers, and that is always sad. And then I think that I will be I know I will be baking something to contribute. I was asked to do either dessert or bread. Maybe I will do both. I don't know yet, but we will see where the baking bug or impulse takes me. At any rate, that's Thanksgiving in a nutshell from this perspective. I am not here to talk about Thanksgiving. That was the last episode. I am here to speak to author Katherine Mazerov about her new novel, her debut novel. It is called Summer Club. Poop in the pool. Let's just jump right in. Poop in the pool, sex on the diving board, a pot-smoking snack bar manager, cheating on the tennis courts, an unruly dog wreaking havoc, and of course, the lawsuit. This and more are all part of the rich pageant of summer at the rundown suburban Meadow Glen Swim and Tennis Club. Behind the scenes of this comedy of errors, something much darker is going on. As club president Lydia Phillips struggles to keep Meadow Glen going for another summer, someone is getting into the club at night for reasons unknown. There's a break-in at Lydia's home, and the club manager is being followed. The stakes get even higher when a shocking discovery is made on the club grounds. And what about that body in the river? That is the description of Summer Club by Katherine Mazerov. Again, that is who I am speaking with today, and this is her debut novel. It starts off kind of lighthearted and silly, poop in the pool, sex on the diving board. It makes you laugh, right? But this is a thriller / suspense novel. It's not a cozy mystery. And so it gets dark as the story goes on. Things are happening in this summer club that Lydia, the main character, is trying to figure out. She gets into some pretty sticky situations, and there is a dog in the book. Her name is Stacy, but she is she's kind of a little poop, actually. She tends to get in herself into trouble, but when it counts, she also plays a role in helping to deal with some of the things that are happening at the summer club. So she kind of redeems her impish behavior there as the story goes on. This book is equal parts lighthearted and kind of more on the dark side in terms of the suspense and thriller elements of the book. Lydia is in over her head on a couple of different levels. You know, she's up to her eyeballs, so maybe she's not over her head on the volunteer work of being president of this rundown summer club, but she's definitely got a lot on her plate. And then, as if having to deal with all kinds of different people and all kinds of different people's issues as members of the club, and then she now has this mystery to figure out, and things quickly take a turn for the worse in terms of solving that mystery. So that is Summer Club, and the author again is Katherine Dean Mazerov. Let's go ahead and turn now to the interview with Katherine. Hi, Katherine. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Sarah, for having me.
I am happy to have you here. We're going to talk about your new novel, Summer Club. Before we get to the novel, though, would you share a little bit about yourself so my listeners can get to know you a bit?
Yes, I am a career journalist. I actually started on my college newspaper at age 18 and eventually came back to Colorado from California, went to work at the Denver Post as a writer, features writer, and then an editor. And then came back several years later and worked as an editor, as an assistant city editor in the newsroom. And I've done lots of freelance writing in between. I wrote quite a bit for the global energy industry. I've written for some regional magazines. So I've had a life of writing and editing, although never planned to write a book, but I find myself here now, not expecting this, but
you should never say never, right?
Yes, but I grew up in Denver, and so I'm a lifelong Westerner, and that's sort of it in a nutshell, I guess.
All right. Well, thank you for that. Again, the book is called Summer Club. It's some part thriller, part cozy mystery. Can you give an overview of the book?
Yes. It's the story of one crazy, steamy summer at the neighborhood swim club. Lydia Phillips is the protagonist. She's a strong, confident woman, volunteer extraordinaire, journalist turned stay-at-home mom, still trying to fill the void from her high-energy job as an editor at the local newspaper. But she's pushed to the max as president of the rundown Meadow Glen Swim and Tennis Club. This is complete with a leaky pool, cracked tennis courts, and a junk food emporium run by a stoned, aging hippie who may have more than candy and corn dogs in mind. There's petty complaining, mishaps and messes, power plays, parent drama, drunken soirees, and a lawsuit that could shutter the club for good. And they keep Lydia awake at night, distracting her from her husband and twin teenage boys. But it's this endless list of shenanigans is perpetrated by a parade of personalities who have come together in a perfect summer storm of bad, self-serving behavior. Yet, it's a series of suspicious and increasingly troubling incidents that push Lydia toward the edge, making this a summer unlike any other. Late night intruders at the club, a break-in at her own home, a mysterious blue sedan following the club manager, and then a startling discovery on the club grounds. When a body surfaces in the river, the newspaper reporter in Lydia begins to suspect these events are somehow connected. As daily chaos rages on at Meadow Glen, Lydia is unable to resist the urge to follow her instincts, that something dark and insidious is indeed afoot. Before long, she becomes consumed by the trail of clues that lead her down a path of baffling twists and turns. Using her investigative reporting skills to unravel a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme and murder right under her nose, she ultimately finds herself in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong people late on an eerie moonless night. What she had once hoped would be a fun, laid-back summer of pool parties, wine tastings, lounging, and friendly tennis matches ends up with Lydia fighting for her life.
It's a lot. I mean, it's definitely not, I hope, your typical summer. I was intrigued by the concept of the pool and tennis club. I grew up in a really, really small town, and while we have a public swimming pool, there's nothing like this that I can compare it to. So it's kind of this insular community, and with any community, you have just a mix of personalities and relationships and people that get along and don't get along. And so there's this whole cast of secondary characters that, well, you mentioned the aging hippie who may or may not be smoking pot on the premises. I mean, just what was your initial inspiration for the story?
Well, as I mentioned, I'd never planned to write a book. People had, throughout my career, I've been asked by people, have you ever considered writing a book? And my answer was always no. I have no desire to write a book, especially a book of fiction, because I come from the nonfiction world. So I was very fulfilled by my work. I've spent a career writing and editing, and I love it, but I just never aspired to write a book. Well, like Lydia, I did quit my job at the Denver Post and at the local newspaper to stay home with my young son, and found myself, while I was happy to be home with him, I wanted to do this. It was my choice. It was a big adjustment coming from the working world, especially a very high intense environment like a newsroom. So I, like Lydia, immersed myself in volunteer work, mostly on behalf of Zach, my son, but then kind of expanded my horizons into other boards and committees and so on, and ended up as president of the board of our little neighborhood swim club. And my husband and son both pleaded with me, please don't do this. And I said, oh, how bad can this be? I'm going to, we've got a manager to run the pool. I can hang out at the pool. I can play tennis. The kids are there all the time. How hard can this be? Well, I quickly learned this made my job in the high intensity, deadline pressure, ego-driven environment of the newsroom seem like child's play. I mean, my phone was ringing off the hook, even leading up to the summer opening on Memorial Day, of people just complaining about everything. I stepped in some gum. Can you replace my flip-flops? My son lost some money at the pool. Can you, I think it was stolen. The cheating on the tennis courts, the helicopter moms, people, this was not a place that served alcohol, but the members could bring in their own alcohol. And there was a lot of drinking, a lot of partying. People, everybody, all these old board members had keys, and they were constantly letting themselves into the club at all hours to skinny dip and have parties and so on. So I just kept saying to myself, you can't make this stuff up. I've got to write a book. So I 9 years ago, I started writing about all these crazy goings on. And I would say probably around 70% of the sort of crazy shenanigans are based on actual things that happened. I've obviously disguised the characters and changed the specific circumstances, but it was pretty crazy.
But no murders.
No murders. And as I got into the book, I realized, I can't just write a book about all this stuff, one anecdote after another. So I realized I needed to introduce a dark element. So I started researching that. And I kept thinking, should I make this a front for drug activity, organized crime? And I just could not figure, it just wasn't happening. I got stuck on that. Meanwhile, I got busy with a lot of other freelance work, and I actually put the book aside for like 3 or 4 years, just forgot about it. And I happened to be talking about it one day with a former colleague, and she said, "Oh, you should write it." So I picked it back up and came across a case of real estate fraud that was quite bizarre, and was able to find some court documents and stories about that. And then I kind of figured out what the kind of general crime I wanted to focus on, and did some additional research about that. And that's how I introduced the elements. So I wove that into the story.
I want to say I can't even imagine being in Lydia's position, being the president of the board of a place like this where all these crazy things keep happening. But minus the murder, I've actually been in a similar position. And it's just amazing the kind of situations that you encounter. And some of them are hilarious, and some of them are mildly frustrating, and some of them just make you want to pull your hair out. It's crazy. But let's go ahead and take our first break of the podcast. And when we come back, we'll be talking more about Lydia as the main character. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast, dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author Katherine Dean Mazerov about her book Summer Club. And in terms of the main character, Lydia, it sounds like there's a lot of probably you and her, or at least your experiences. But what about Lydia's character do you think will most resonate with readers?
You're right. It is somewhat like me. As I said, I'm a journalist, like former journalist turned stay-at-home mom, like Lydia. So there are definite parallels. I would say Lydia is a strong character. She's a strong woman. She doesn't take any guff from anybody. And there's a lot of men at the club who kind of try to bully her and push her around. And she's tough. She stands firm. I think the book resonates with women also, based on the issue that so many of us face, balancing career and family. Whether you choose to give up your career to stay home, or try to balance the two, work part-time or full-time, and try to be a good mom and so on, it's very difficult for women. And she struggles with this. And she's probably one of the more complicated characters in the book, because she's clearly dealing with this. She's not June Cleaver. She just is not content to stay home and bake cookies and be the perfect housewife. She's come from a very busy, intense career, and she misses that. She misses that energy and that adrenaline rush that she used to get covering stories. So once this crime aspect starts to unfold, she is she just cannot let it go, to the point that toward the middle end of the book, she becomes so immersed in it that she neglects things at home. I mean, she forgets to go to the grocery store. The kids, so there's no food in the house, and the kids have to go find food somewhere because there's nothing to eat. Her husband, fortunately, is the primary cook, and he's a really good cook. So she doesn't have to worry about the cooking, but she just becomes somewhat very distracted by all this. And not that she's not a bad mom. The kids are good. She's clearly she's a good parent and so on, but she cannot help herself from following this like she would a story developing the newspaper.
And now in Lydia's defense, she does have twin 14-year-old boys. So
yes.
They can eat you out of house and home in a matter of about 35 seconds.
That's true. That is true. Yes. I only had one son, but when they get to that age, they do have a big appetite.
Yeah.
Endless.
It seems like it's bottomless. The other character in the book who actually plays a pretty significant role is the dog, Stacy. Yes. Was she initially part of the book, or did you add her in later? How did that come about?
She was initially part of the book. She is based on, we've had 3 rescue dogs in our family, Stanley, Gracie, and Stella, hence the name Stacy. So she's kind of an amalgam of these dogs, and she's a very spoiled rescue dog. Her behavior very much mimics the behavior of all of our dogs who pretty much run the house. We've never had a dog that jumped the fence constantly, but and we did not live near our little neighborhood swim club, but all of our dogs had they had the opportunity, would have loved to go into the club and disrupt everything and get into the snack bar and steal steaks and have a wonderful time. So anyway, I'm a dog lover. So I wanted to have a dog in my book because I think the animals add so much to the story. And Stella, our current dog, thinks this is all about her and she wants her own Instagram account now, but she's the spoiled nature of the dogs these are our dogs for sure.
I think Stella should just skip the Instagram account and go straight to TikTok.
Oh, okay. She has done a few videos, but yes. Okay.
Obviously you have experience with the summer club and some of the situations that happened while you were volunteering there. But what types of research did you do for the book?
Well, you're right. I am a career journalist, and I am a big believer in background research and firsthand information. And as an editor, I always encourage reporters to develop sources, go to the scene of a crime or event rather than rely on the computer or what a spokesperson said. And yes, because I'd lived much of the story, I could draw on something that's even better than research, my own knowledge and perspective. I know firsthand how swim meets are run and how people cheat at tennis. I've seen helicopter parents and neurotic swim team moms at their worst. I've served on numerous volunteer boards and observed how power-hungry members use organizations to further their own agendas. These are basically the interpersonal dynamics and universal foibles of human nature that you referred to earlier, Sarah, that emerge when people are thrown together in a situation, whether it's the PTA or the HOA or any kind of volunteer board, the list goes on. And many of the personalities and events in Summer Club are amalgams of real people and situations. But while I could use my imagination to vividly enhance scenes and characters, I knew that even works of fiction must describe events in a realistic, accurate way. For example, for the pothead snack bar manager who runs her own marijuana growing operation, I researched the provisions of the law in Colorado, which is the first state that legalized recreational marijuana, and had to, learn about that, make sure I was being accurate on the provisions of the law, what's allowed under the law if you grow your own marijuana and so on. And of course, in the story, Lydia finds herself using her own investigative reporting and research skills to unravel a troubling mystery. And I mentioned earlier that I had come across this case of real estate fraud. And so I spent quite a bit of time pulling documents from that particular case and looking up other cases, basically Ponzi scheme kinds of fraud and so on, to make sure I was giving an accurate portrayal of how these things work and how people can basically fool seemingly very smart, educated, savvy people into falling into these situations, investor fraud, and so on. And so I did spend quite a bit of time researching that. Of course, you have to be careful where you're getting your information, because you can find anything on the internet, as you know. And so I had to look at my sources and so on. And a friend of mine had been involved with the company who had experienced a similar fraud case. And I talked to him quite a bit about what had gone on. So that did involve some extra work, which is fine. I mean, most authors end up doing research for their books, and I think that's very important. But it was, I enjoyed it. I learned a lot about Ponzi schemes.
You probably learned more than you ever really thought you needed to know.
Right. I did. You're absolutely right.
When it comes to your characters, do you like to have a good sense of those characters before you start writing, or did some of the character development happen while you were writing? How did that work for you?
I had a pretty good sense before I started writing. That was part of the motivation for writing the book. All these different personalities coming together, and just as I mentioned, just people's sometimes their worst traits emerge in these situations. People have their own agendas when they come into a situation where you've got a bunch of people thrown together for a 3-month period, and they're people that don't necessarily socialize anyway. They're just suddenly together all the time, and these situations emerge. So I had a lot of my characters in mind when I started the book. I embellished them as I kept writing, and added other characteristics to them that I thought might make them more colorful and vivid.
You mentioned earlier that you had the experiences from the club, and then you started to write about those experiences, but wanted something in addition to just those experiences, those sort of anecdotal episodes. Were you always thinking of adding kind of a mystery / thriller element, or did you think about other genres? How did that come about?
Well, once I realized I needed to make the story richer, I was pretty set on kind of a suspense mystery genre. And I like that genre, and I wanted to create some tension. I wanted people to laugh and enjoy the craziness of the book, but I also wanted them to feel the suspense of the story. And I purposely did not get real graphic with the crime aspect. I mean, there is a body in the river. I don't get into, the readers do not experience the actual murder. So it's not real graphic. I did not get real graphic in the forensics aspect of it, because I wanted to keep that flavor of keeping it fun, but at the same time having this dark element. And it does get toward the end, when Lydia finds herself in trouble, it's not real graphic, but it's I would say
it's intense.
Pretty intense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then obviously I'm not going to talk about how the book ends, but the last sentence leaves it open. Are you planning on potentially bringing Lydia back for any other mysteries?
Yes, I am. I'm working through that now. One of the things working for a newspaper as a reporter, you don't really have time to do an outline. And I've never been fond of outlines. I hated doing outlines in junior high school. So I've always been averse to outlines. I did do an outline for this book, but it was pretty basic. If and when I do my next book, I will do a much more detailed outline. because I think it took me, as I said, I started the book, I think 9 or 10 years ago. I did put it aside for several years. But when I really got serious about finishing the book, it took me 1.5 years from the time of my first draft to getting it published, because I did so much rewriting. And this was after I had added the suspense element to the book. But I kept going back into it and rewriting and adding and changing things. And I think if I'd had a good, solid, detailed outline, I would have saved myself a lot of time. So yes, I do plan on if doing another book and bringing back Lydia, but I will start with an outline first. And that's what I'm working on now, is a good, solid outline. So I have a much better roadmap of where I'm going with the story before I start actually writing. And I love just jumping into the stories. And I've always done that. I mean, when you work at a newspaper, you just start writing. You don't have time to prepare. So this was a whole different experience for me.
It's probably one of those phrases that is both completely obvious and at the same time like, oh, yeah, that does make sense kind of things where, not all writing is the same. Writing fiction is different than writing nonfiction. Writing different genres, can be different than writing other types of genres. So, yeah, it's just one of those things where you don't always think about maybe you don't always think about the differences in different styles of writing, different types of writing, etc. But let's go ahead and take our second break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll be talking a bit more about writing in those different styles and genres and fiction versus nonfiction, etc. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. Before the break, Katherine was speaking about writing as a journalist and writing nonfiction as opposed to writing fiction, writing her debut novel. Just to refresh your memory, what we were talking about before the break so that we can jump right back into the conversation with Katherine.
And this was your first experience writing fiction, correct?
Yes. And that was interesting. I found, I had some beta readers read the book, and the feedback I got was, you're rushing through these scenes. Slow down. And I realized I feel like I'm on deadline. I have to get through this. I've got to get through this. And I had to slow myself down. And once I figured that out and realized that, it was a lot more fun because I could take my time. It was fiction. I could do whatever I wanted with these scenes. I didn't have to stick to, a finite idea. I could expand on it. And that was another challenge for me, and probably added more time to the writing process, was just making that transition from nonfiction to fiction and fleshing out the scenes and the characters and making them more vivid and so on. And that was a fun, I didn't expect that to happen, but that was a fun outcome of my journey, I guess.
And I can imagine that you would have had more word limits or were, guidelines in terms of length in your other writings. So
oh yes, you always have deadlines, finite space. You can't just keep writing. And so I started to really enjoy writing fiction. Of course, again, something I never planned to do, but once I got into it and got that kind of awareness that I needed to just slow down and take my time and enjoy myself, I realized if I am enjoying writing it, then hopefully the readers will enjoy reading it more than just, okay, this happened, and this happened. So sort of just, let it play out.
Mm-hmm. Are there any, you've obviously written for a long time, you've written as a journalist, you've written as a freelancer. What in terms of nonfiction writing is kind of your favorite? I don't think the genre is the right word, niche maybe to write in.
I spent most of my time writing in the features sections, personality profiles, human interest stories, trend stories versus hard news. I have done hard news, but I really prefer the people stories. It allows for much more creativity. You usually have more space. You usually have a little more time to work on the story. It's not a deadline situation where you're reporting on a crime or a city council meeting or something. You've got an opportunity to expand it a little bit, and you can come up with your own ideas in the features section. One of the things that influenced me early on in my writing, well, there were two things. When I was sort of coming of age, right before I really got into journalism, there were two parallel phenomena going on, I guess. One was investigative reporting in the wake of Watergate. Everybody wanted to be an investigative reporter. Everybody wanted to be Woodward and Bernstein. And the journalism schools everybody was applying to journalism school. I did not go to journalism school. I actually majored in political science. But that was one trend. The other trend that was happening was something called the new journalism. And that's a term that was coined by the author Tom Wolfe, who wrote The Right Stuff. And he actually published an anthology that had featured many authors of this time, himself, Tom Wolfe, Norman Mailer, Joan Didion, and so on. And basically, it's the non-fiction novel. These are books that are true stories, completely true stories, but they read like a novel. The most iconic, I think, is In Cold Blood by Truman Capote, about this horrific murder in Kansas of a Kansas family by these two, I guess they were kids at the time, but it was brutal, and it was for no reason. And they just went on this killing spree. And Truman Capote spent months and months and months with these two killers and spent time with them in jail and followed their trail. And the book it reads like a novel. It is gripping. Another one is, Tom Wolfe's The Right Stuff, about the NASA program, the astronauts, all nonfiction, but it's written in a way that it reads like a novel. And that has always interested me. And I always tried to incorporate that into my writing in features at the newspaper. The problem is in a newspaper, again, as you mentioned, you have limited space, but that kind of features writing allows for a writer to incorporate that style. And, I've always been intrigued by that. And that's been a great influence on my writing. So this book, even though it's fiction, I felt like I was able to incorporate that into the book and describe it, the way to describe the characters and so on, because in the nonfiction novel, everything is very descriptive. It's, in fact, back in the 70s, I think Tom Wolfe said the nonfiction novel is the best literature out there right now. And there was a lot of authors doing this kind of work. there'd be excerpts of their work in magazines and so on, but many of them wrote books, and they're still very popular. I mean, people still read them today.
I wonder if the part of that is why true crime podcasts are so very popular now. If that kind of came out.
I'm sure that's a part of it. Yeah, they are. Yeah, they are. And somebody mentioned that to me as well. Yes, the podcasts are now coming in, and people are riveted by these true crime podcasts. I mean, they're just the way they're told. I mean, there's that old saying, what Mark Twain said, reality is stranger than fiction. It's really true. So
yeah, absolutely. From your own experience, then, do you have advice for aspiring authors, whether that's nonfiction or fiction?
I would say, if for someone, an aspiring writer, there are now a lot of resources for writers. I belong to a group, it's a national group called Sisters in Crime, and I know you've heard of it. I'm a member of the Colorado chapter. They are a very active organization, and you don't have to be an author to be a member. In Colorado, we have 3 chapters in Colorado. They do book clubs. Each chapter does a book club every month where an author can talk about their book. And a lot of the people who go to these they say, I'm not a writer, I'm a reader. You can learn a lot. They have great resources for, how to, if you're a crime writer, how to understand the law, how to develop riveting characters, how to create a death scene, all the different creative ways you can make your characters die. I mean, all kinds of things. And I can tune into a group in Ohio or the state of Washington of course, now with Zoom, and everybody's used to Zoom now with following the pandemic and so on. It's easy to plug into these things, and that's a great resource. There's many areas, cities have writers' workshop groups. I would join those. Become a book reviewer. I don't know the process for doing that, but a lot of avid readers become book reviewers. And I think when you review a book, you probably look at it much more critically, and you start to see things that distinguish a particular book from another. And so I think that's always good to keep reading, obviously, but when you read it, when you have to write a review of it, you read it differently. And I think you learn a lot. As far as the actual writing, I think writing for me is, I guess, kind of equal parts art form and craft. It's basically a construction project that starts with a foundation out of an idea as the basis for a good page turner. And then you sort of put it together, and you have to develop the transitions and make sure it flows and so on. You need to be creative, but you need to have organizational skills. I think a book should do at least one of 3 things. Entertain, in other words, give people an escape from their daily lives, take them someplace. It should resonate. You recognize a character or an event in the book where that I know that person, I know that character, it resonates with you. Or enlighten, educate somebody about something. And if you can I think it's difficult to do all 3 of those things, but I think if you can do at least one, then you are in a good, then you've already made it. I think you're connecting with the reader. The other thing I would advise is don't leave the reader in the dust. So often, and I've seen this in my career as an editor, and I've seen it with authors, all books, many books are written because an author has an idea about something that interests him or her, and that's great. But you need to understand that the reader may not be quite as interested as you are, and you need to know when enough is enough. You don't want to take your reader deep down into a rabbit hole or multiple rabbit holes or deep into the weeds where they just get so lost in subject matter that becomes so academic that they lose interest in the book. So you have to think about the reader. Why would someone want to read my book? Knowing that they're not going to be as interested in the subject as maybe you are, but even though they may want to learn about it, but you have to constantly be thinking, why would anybody want to read my book? And that's a question we used to ask at the newspaper all the time. We called it the so what question. Who's going to read this story? Why are we doing this story? Why are we putting this story on page one? Who are we connecting with? Who are our readers? So you really need to know your reader. And I guess those would be my key words of wisdom to an aspiring writer.
It is time for our last break of the podcast, but when we come back, Katherine will be talking about the genres and authors that she turns to when she reads for herself. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back. Pets bring such joy to our lives, and the GSMC Pets Podcast is here to share in that joy. We'll tell stories of pets finding their forever homes, acting in unexpected ways, being helpful, or just being silly. Whether you love dogs, cats, llamas, reptiles, fish, or you've never met an animal you didn't like, the GSMC Pets Podcast is for you. Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Katherine Dean Mazerov.
In terms of reading, then, when you take the time to read for yourself, what are your go-to genres and authors?
Well, I love historical fiction. Kristen Hanna. I loved A Gentleman in Moscow, Immortals. I mean, thinking of the books I've read fairly recently because my favorite authors always change. But when I was growing up, I devoured Nancy Drew books. So I like historical fiction, A Gentleman in Moscow, Anthony Doerr, All the Light We Cannot See, Kristen Hanna, The Nightingale. Love those books. I like mysteries and suspense books, although I'm not one that gets totally absorbed in the series of authors who write series like James Patterson. I have read James Patterson, but I don't devour all of his books. I like a variety. I guess I'm not a big sci-fi, fantasy, or supernatural genre lover. I'm not into those books. I like books that I can relate to, or that I can sort of immerse myself into a period of history that I find interesting. I like Leanne Moriarty because I like her characters. I think she's a good women's fiction writer, and I can relate to a lot of the characters in her books. I've read a couple of books by Yaa Gyasi. I read Homegoing, which is the story starts in the 1600s, where it traces two African girls. One is sold into slavery, and ultimately her family all ends up in America, and it traces that family line, and the other stays in Africa and traces that family line. And then their descendants, the descendants of one of them goes back to Africa. It's a very interesting story. Nonfiction. The most recent nonfiction book I read, it was a huge book called The Prize. It's basically a history of the oil and gas industry. which is fascinating. And there's a lot of this is not fiction, but a history in that, of how these oil companies basically developed and colonized Africa, Middle East, and so on for the oil. And that was interesting. That was a very, as I said, a big book, nonfiction. I also recently read American Dirt by Janine Cummins, which I thought was riveting. I know it's been controversial, but it's basically the story of a woman who is and her young son who are escaping Acapulco, escaping the drug cartels, and the journey all through Mexico that they have to take to get to America. And it was quite vivid. I know it was based on it's based on true events, but it's not. It's a fiction book, but it's, I think, probably very realistic. So I don't know. I read a variety of books. I just am finishing reading a book called The Cape Doctor. And it's based on a true story in the 1800s of a young woman who very, very bright and became someone sort of a sponsor, a friend of a family, recognized her talent. But in order for her to become a doctor, she had to disguise herself as a man and spend her whole life living as a man. And that was very interesting. So I do a variety. I'm in a couple of book clubs, and we try to pick books that are pretty diverse. And we've read some really good books, several of the ones I've mentioned.
Awesome. I love it. In terms of your internet presence, if you could share your website and any social media that you are accessible on.
My website is just my author name, www.katherinedeanmazerov.com. The links to all my social media are on there. My Twitter is @KMazerov. My Instagram is Katherine Dean Mazerov, my author name. And but the best place to get that information is probably my website.
All right, perfect. Thank you. Katherine, we've talked about quite a few different things today, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you were hoping to be able to talk about during our time together?
I think we've covered pretty much everything. I know there's so many books out there, which is great. I would just say for people who want to aspire to write a book, just go for it. And just, well, as we talked earlier, read a lot and don't get discouraged. Writing is hard. Even I've written my whole life, and every time the most daunting thing I do is to sit down and stare at a blank screen. And the one thing, my experience has allowed me to realize that I can overcome that. But anybody who tells you that writing is easy, I don't believe it. I think it is hard. It's starting out is very hard. So don't get discouraged.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you also for taking the time to talk to me about writing, and especially to talk to me about your debut novel, Summer Club. I so appreciate you coming on the podcast. Well,
thank you, Sarah. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you so much once again to Katherine for talking to me about Summer Club and writing and dogs and all of the fun things that we covered in this interview. I hope you enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed being able to sit down with Katherine and talk about it and, recording it on all of those good things. So again, just in case you somehow blanked out on it, the book is called Summer Club and it is thriller, suspense, with a smattering of cozy in there if you count Stacy, the silly dog. How much do you love that Stacy is a combination of Stan and Stella and Gracie? So Stacy, it's just perfect. A perfect tribute to the rescue dogs in their life, in their family's lives. So I love that. At any rate, if you are looking for we're in the fall now, so if you want to think fondly back to the days of summer that we have just exited, not just exited, but maybe it's snowing where you are and you want to think about lovely, long, hot summer days. And maybe you like those long, hot summer days to be interrupted by, murder. Then you should definitely check out Summer Club. It's a lot of fun, and it sounds like there's going to be at least one more story involving Lydia and possibly the intrepid Stacy. So looking forward to that. It's almost Thanksgiving, and again, I hope your week is going well. I hope that you have whatever kind of a Thanksgiving you most look forward to, and I also hope that you'll join me for the next episode when I will be speaking with author Marcy Maxfield. This is another debut novel. This one's called M's Awful Good Fortune. It is not a mystery. It's not quite a memoir, although it started out as a memoir, and so it's there's a lot of stuff going on in this book in terms of, well, you're just gonna have to tune in and find out, because it's about a woman and her husband who her husband's job takes them all over the world for work, and she is considered a tag-along or a trailing spouse, and so she goes with on these trips, not necessarily wanting to move and live all over the world, but doing it for her marriage and all of the, let's just go with zaniness that ensues from being that trailing spouse. So join me for that interview. In the meantime, if you haven't done so already, please do follow the podcast on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Also, leaving a review is wonderful. Not only of the books that you are reading, please do review those as well. That is so helpful to authors, but also of this podcast. It can be written, it can be starred, it can be both. Whatever moves your spirit to do, I really, really appreciate it, and it does help us to get the podcast out to more listeners such as yourselves. Happy Thanksgiving. Eat lots of turkey. Or not. If you're a vegetarian, eat whatever you have on Thanksgiving that is not turkey. Maybe it's tofu. I don't know. Actually, tell me. I would love to hear, if you're vegan or vegetarian, what you have in place of turkey. Because I am just interested in those things. And I'm also nosy, so let me know what you're having. Actually, you know what? Whether you're vegetarian, vegan, not vegetarian, or vegan, or something else entirely, let me know what you're having for your Thanksgiving dinner. I would love to hear all of your menus. I'm just, again, nosy that way. But whatever it is, I hope it's wonderful. And I hope if you have a long weekend, or even if you don't have a long weekend, I hope your Thanksgiving holiday affords you plenty of time to go and get yourself lost in a good book. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.